PCS orders, 67 days, non-negotiable. The home needs to sell before the reporting date, or the seller becomes a landlord from 800 miles away. Welcome to this explainer, where we are going to tackle head-on the absolute most rigid, uncompromising timeline in residential real estate.
You know, when military families are ordered to relocate, the stakes are just incredibly high. The clock literally starts ticking the second those orders drop. We are talking about strict federal mandates here, folks, which means failing to sell, well, it's just not an option on the table.
So let's move right into Section 1, the PCS deadline, 60 to 90 days.
Now, unlike a standard corporate move where the company might just buy out your house or give you a totally flexible timeline, military moves operate on a completely different wavelength. A permanent change of station, or a PCS, represents mandatory military orders. You generally have a super tight 60 to 90-day window to pack up your entire life. There's zero room to negotiate and absolutely zero room for an appeal. Bottom line, when the federal government says move, you move right then and there. Okay, moving on to Section 2, pricing for the timeline, capturing the Texas market.
To really understand how these immovable deadlines dictate strategy, let's talk about El Paso, Texas. Get this, Fort Bliss drives a massive 30% of all residential transactions in that market. 30%. That is a huge slice of the pie. It means if you are operating out there, you absolutely have to master this specific timeline. Because if you don't, you are leaving a massive portion of the market completely unserved.
Let's break down how this actually plays out in the real world. Imagine you're working with a sergeant in northeast El Paso who just got orders to Fort Hood. Their reporting date is exactly 67 days out. Now, say their home's current market value sits somewhere between $245,000 and $255,000. If you decide to price that house right at the absolute top of the range at $255,000, you are making a critical error. Why? Because to leave just 4 weeks for a standard closing process, you need to be generating solid offers by day 21. If you price too high and that house sits past day 67, your seller is already gone. They've already left the state.
Which brings us to Section 3, the BAH buyer ceiling, Horizon City constraints. Because time isn't our only restriction here. We also have to look really closely at the hard limits on buyer purchasing power.
Here is the crucial takeaway. In El Paso, a staggering 44% of entry-level transactions, meaning homes under $300,000, are financed using VA loans. That tells us your buyer pool is fundamentally tied to military allowances. You are overwhelmingly going to be selling to other military families.
And that brings up a really fascinating difference in strategy. Traditional pricing is often driven by market sentiment, right? It's about flexible negotiations, testing the waters, pricing based on vibes. But PCS pricing, that is strictly capped by Basic Allowance for Housing Rates, also known as BAH. You aren't pricing based on feelings or market hype, you are pricing based on strict, concrete government formulas.
Let's actually do the math on this really quick. In 2026, the E6 BAH rate for El Paso is exactly $1,512 per month. If you look at current rates, that allowance supports a maximum purchase price of approximately $270,000. Now picture a listing in Horizon City that's priced at $285,000. Sure, you might think it's a totally fair market price, but you've just mathematically priced yourself out of what 60% of the military buyer pool can actually afford. Homes priced at or below that BAH-supported ceiling, they sell 40% faster. And honestly, that is exactly the kind of speed we need when we're staring down a 67-day deadline.
Let's pivot to Section 4, remote landlord costs, the price of failing the deadline. What actually happens when those deadlines are missed? Well, it looks a lot like $8,400. I want to let that number sink in for a second. That represents the average first-year remote landlord costs a seller is forced to just absorb if their home doesn't sell before they have to leave. Between maintenance, property management fees, and the inevitable vacant months, it adds up incredibly fast. The financial consequences of failing to sell before departure are severely damaging.
And honestly, the stakes can get even crazier. Consider a Fort Bliss dual military sales scenario where both spouses serve. Imagine they get two totally different sets of orders with two different reporting dates, heading to two completely different destinations. The urgency literally doubles right there. The communication complexity, that triples. You are managing a transaction with the single most rigid timeline in residential real estate, and failing to sell before they separate households and leave Texas is nothing short of disastrous for them.
Finally, Section 5, managing with CMA flow, navigating the deadline.
So how do we operationalize this highly stressful process without missing a beat?
Because PCS deals have the absolute hardest deadlines in real estate, you really need a rock-solid workflow system like CMA Flow. The dashboard actively prioritizes those non-negotiable PCS deadlines, so a 60-day window deal never just goes quiet on you. It has a days since last update metric that visually tracks that severe urgency and an email drafter that automatically creates factual, deadline-aware updates. It's tailored perfectly for highly stressed military sellers, respecting both their extremely tight timeline and their state of mind.
So, I want to leave you with this final thought as we wrap up this explainer. Is your pricing strategy moving fast enough for a federal order? It's a tough question, for sure, but if you truly want to step up and serve military families under pressure, it's honestly the only question that matters. Thanks so much for joining me.